So really just wanted to start by welcoming everybody here. Thanks so much to so many of you for coming along for this discussion. And first of all, I wanted to say, my name is Alice Roberts and I'm from CPRE London. So it might be a bit strange to be for us to be hosting an event on the housing crisis and what next for London. But I suppose from my point of view, I came to this from having been asked to speak at several events over the last few years on the issue of the green belt and why we should or shouldn't build on the green belt as a means of solving the housing crisis. And increasingly, as I was doing this, I was becoming increasingly frustrated at how the problem had become presented as one which was singularly about the planning system, as if the planning system is a problem, and communities opposing development, so the NIMBYism issue, despite it being really very hard for communities to oppose development. And despite the planning system being really very good at issuing planning permissions, and that's something that we can come back to. So I was very disappointed, I think, to be listening to Radio 4 this morning, literally this morning, talking about those very same issues in the context of the King's speech and in the context of the new bill, which will be about, in theory, about streamlining the planning system. So what we wanted to do today was to really start to unpick why we don't think that that is the basis of the housing crisis, what the housing crisis is really about, and really what do we need to talk about to start to genuinely solve the housing crisis in London from this point forward. Sem, hi, and thank you for joining us. So I was just saying that even this morning, Nick Robinson on Radio 4 is again talking about streamlining the planning process, and that is despite there being 350,000 planning permissions in place for 350,000 homes in London at the moment, which are not being built. And that's a 7-year supply. And we know that there's previously developed land available within London for many years beyond that. We also know that it's extremely hard for communities to oppose planning permission, to oppose planning consents, and that in fact NIMBYism is again one of these issues, which is where a narrative has been created which presents this as the problem. So today what we want to do is to ask our speakers. So we're joined by Sem Moema, who's London Assembly member and Labour lead for housing at the London Assembly, and Josh Ryan Collins, who I'll get you, Josh, to introduce yourself in a moment, and maybe Sem, you could just do the same. And to try to get underneath these issues with a series of questions to both of our speakers, but also to Michael Ball of Just Space, who will hopefully interject if there's anything you want to add when I've asked my questions. So Michael, just before we go to Sam and Ryan to introduce themselves, can you just introduce Just Space quickly, who we've been working with on this issue very recently? Michael.
Yeah. So Just Space is a network of hundreds of grassroots campaigns and local groups across London. We only work in London, working closely with the Bartlett School of Planning and other academics. And we welcome new members all the time. We met around 20 years ago, the core, how it started around the London Plan, the first London Plan. And that's been our focus all the way through, is this strategic document about planning. And our experience all over is that planning is weak in the face of developers pushing inappropriate schemes that are undermining often the poorest communities and those that suffer the most. So we've been utterly astonished by the narrative that's risen up in the last year, that it's actually developers are being prevented by those pesky planners from building housing. That diagnosis, in our view, is clearly wrong, and we need to get that diagnosis right for a new government to be able to actually sort out so much of the problems that are affecting us. We published a manifesto in April, and we've produced a charter, a housing charter in May, which CPRE are in partnership with, and we're hoping to get other organisations on board with. We want to work with other housing campaigns to try and just write the story correctly so that we get the right solutions for this. We've got a meeting this evening, 31 Lee Street. We'll put something in the chat about that meeting. So please come along. If you're from a group or a campaign or a NASN campaign, come along and find out about us. Thank you. Good luck in this wonderful discussion.
Great stuff. So what I would like people to do is to, this is meant to be a bit of a discussion. And if you do have things that you have to say, please do write them in the chat. So at the end of when I've finished going through the questions that I have to the panel, we hope we'll have time for some questions, but we do want to make sure that you have a chance to say your piece. And so put what you want to say in the chat, and we will circulate the chat at the end. So I'll email everybody again with what's been put in the chat so that everybody can have a look at that, because I know it's quite hard to follow speakers and also follow the chat. So before I come to my questions, if we can just very quickly get our speakers to introduce themselves. So we go to Josh first.
Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me okay. And thanks for the invitation to Just Space and CPRE. Josh Ryan Collins. I'm a professor in economics and finance at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, which is also in the Bartlett. So yeah, I'm a macroeconomist but done a lot of work on the economics of land and housing. Thanks.
And I'll go next. My name is Sem Moema, and apologies for being a little bit late. I had a few IT issues, but I am the London Assembly member for Hackney, Islington and Waltham Forest. I am also the chair this year for the the Housing Committee, and I am deputy chair of the Planning Committee. So just to explain for those of you that don't know, I'm sure you do, but the committees that we have here at City Hall, we operate on a cross-party basis, and our scrutiny is conducted in that way. But I'm a Labour and Cooperative Assembly member, so some of my responses will be from both perspectives today.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm going to go straight on to the questions now. So the first question is, how do you define the housing crisis? And this is really quite a short, I'm expecting quite short answers here, but I do want to start off on the right basis. So should we go to Sam first?
Great, thank you. So I guess I would say that from London's perspective, and I think actually the country as a whole to lesser levels of acuity, but the housing crisis that we face, we have multiple crises in different parts of the housing market. Appreciate that might not be language that everybody wants to agree with, but we have a number of markets, whether it's private, social, for rent, for sale, shared ownership. There are crises of, I think across the piece, affordability, which is no small part caused by the disastrous budget that we had from Liz Truss. And so if you're a homeowner, if you're a renter, interest rates are a really big issue. If you're trying to build, servicing loans is also a really big issue. So affordability, I also hopefully will touch a little bit on the private rented sector and what is feeding what in this cycle. So the first things around affordability. Availability, we were lucky enough to have Michael come to a planning committee that I chaired recently. We started some work to look at the London plan. We will be starting work to look at the London plan this year. The availability of housing is really, I think, uppermost. So we have a supply issue, but we also have the perverse situation where most, if not all, people in temporary accommodation are housed somewhere. It's just not a home that's necessarily suitable for their needs, and it's not in the right place, or it's too expensive. And yeah, that comes on to my third point, which is around suitability. The types of homes that are being built, who can afford them? And I think wherever you are in the housing market, whether you're a social or private renter, whether you're somebody who wants to be an owner-occupier, or you are an owner-occupier, the housing that we are dealing with, that we are faced with in the market, that we have access to, is not affordable to people. And that is a wider conversation about wages not keeping up with rents or mortgages, or just housing costs as a whole. But I think that really is a really big issue when it comes to, as Michael mentioned already, developers saying that they can't build because planners are stopping them. Actually, there is a question about what it is that developers are building and for whom. Muted, Alice.
And Josh, I think you had a slide or two for this question. So if you'd like to share your screen.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so agree with what Sam said there in terms of describing the crisis. My work on the UK housing crisis has focused much more on the demand side drivers of the housing crisis, and in particular on the demand for housing as an investment asset or a financial asset for investment, as opposed to housing's function as a consumption good, a place to live, bring up children, have a family. And that for me is the fundamental driver of the problems that Sam's outlined. What you have really is, since the 1980s, a number of dynamics, including the deregulation of the mortgage finance system, shifts in tax policy, a strong bias towards home ownership as the dominant tenure in policy in multiple different policy frameworks. And I actually think planning is kind of, to some extent, just a very minor issue in this problem compared to those previously mentioned issues. I just wanted to share this sort of graphic that no doubt some of you will have seen a version of before, but this is my attempt to kind of summarize, I guess, these demand side drivers of the housing crisis. And you'll see there at the center of this kind of dynamic, and this is all about feedback cycles and reinforcing dynamics. The housing market needs to be understood as a dynamic system, not as a sort of static thing where if you make a small adjustment to one sector, then everything will come good. There's these very powerful drivers. So essentially, the central problem is rising house prices and land values lead to increasing demand for residential property as a financial asset. And that leads to more financial flows in a deregulated mortgage market going into an inherently limited supply of locationally desirable housing. There's an inherent limit to the places people actually want to live, where they can get a decent job, where there's a nice environment, good schools. There's always going to be an inherent limit on that, pushing up land values and thus pushing up house prices, and leading to even more demand then for housing as a financial asset, as house prices rise at a considerably faster rate in many cases than other financial assets. So they become the most attractive form of financial asset. And banks, of course, make money out of big mortgage loans, and but if the price of housing is rising, then the collateral that backs those loans is also rising. So banks feel able to carry on lending. And then we have financial innovations, meaning institutional investors from capital markets have also entered the housing market in the late 1990s. Very little discussion of this sort of financialization story. Rather than pushing back on this, what governments have done over the last 30, 40 years is identify the problem as a lack of spending power on the behalf of households to buy homes, to enter home ownership. So what they've done is they've come up with various subsidies for homeowners, Help to Buy, very tax-friendly policies for home ownership, no capital gains on primary residences, discounts, low taxes on relatively low taxes on second homes, and weaken the non-market, non-home ownership housing provision with the privatization of social housing. So they've sort of just enhanced these dynamics rather than pushing back on them. So the other sort of key argument I wanted to make was this has resulted in a extremely problematic distribution of the housing stock. And I've got a chart here. I have to say this was done by my PhD student, Stefan Horn, not me. But anyway, he was happy for me to put this up here. He's basically looked at the distribution of domestic space across households in London. And what you can see here is that you have sort of 20% of households in what's generally described as overcrowded conditions. Most households have one spare bedroom, which you might call a sort of acceptable level of comfort or sufficiency. But then you have an almost identical 20% of people who live in houses with 2 or more spare bedrooms. So that is an incredibly inefficient way of organizing the housing stock. And so for me, we have to think of what sort of policies would enable us to improve this distribution. And the reason for that is London is essentially a second-hand housing market. The London housing market mainly consists of transactions in existing properties, not new build. And even if Labour hits its target of 300,000 new homes, which I think very few people believe will happen, London will still remain a market that is mainly involved in the selling and buying of existing homes. If we can just get a small percentage of those existing transactions to go to the people who actually need them, as opposed to the people who can afford them and leverage the most credit to buy them, we can make a much bigger impact in the housing crisis than building more and more homes. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much both. I think we've kind of strayed right into what are the causes of the problem there. So what I really wanted to kind of do with that first question was to say, yes, we have people who can't afford to live, people in insecure homes, very often people living in poor conditions, and that is a very different way of presenting the crisis than saying that we don't have enough homes. And I think that's really where I wanted the starting point for this discussion to be. So unless, Michael, you have anything to add on that specific point of how we define the crisis, then we'll move on to the next question, which, Josh, I think you've already said quite a bit about. So maybe we'll go to Sem first, and then Josh, maybe if you have anything else to add after. So Sem, the second question is about what are the causes of this crisis, if they, as we're saying, are not necessarily just about building new homes, or actually we can call that one of the answers, I suppose, that are being proposed. But where do you see the causes, the main causes of the crisis, the things that we have to get on to grips with in order to solve the crisis?
Yeah, thank you. So I take your point that it won't be just about building new homes, but I would say that there isn't really a solution without building those new homes. And also, to Josh's point about the numbers and the target as an aspiration, I think it's a good principle to have that in regulation or in guidance, because what we've seen is Michael was there, literally in the room, but we've seen someone else has said in the chat, people like Barrett say that they can't build new homes because there isn't the market, and I will use that language, though I appreciate it's contested, but the market can't absorb what is being built, and so they can't continue to make a profit. And I think the root of the problem for me is we don't really have a planning system which plans what needs to go where for whom properly, in the sense of the number of homes that we need, where they should be, the type of homes that they should be, the amenities that are needed around them, the infrastructure, transport, all of those sorts of things. So I think there is a crisis which could be resolved through the planning and infrastructure bill to an extent, or at least begin to have that conversation on a national front. I think that'd would go a really, really long way. I think we've seen over years and if not decades, the marketization of homes, so housing as an asset rather than as a home. And that has caused situations where, so I worked in the housing sector. I have seen this from different sides. I've worked in public affairs and I've worked in development as well before I was elected. So I see that homes are built for the investment potential that they have. They are not built for people. So we end up in a situation where, as Josh has outlined, people will be traveling around the capital and will see new developments, homes, and some of those might be, belong to somebody, but there are not people living there. So I think really getting to grips with the way in which developers, particularly large-scale developers, make those investment decisions. I think one of the things that I would want to see come out of either here at City Hall and any changes to the London plan when that comes, or to the National Planning Policy Framework, is really an intention to build homes not as an asset, but as an end in themselves. I think we really need to get our heads around that. I also think that the lack of regulation in other parts of the housing market have led, or deregulation in many cases, have led to a very, very acute crisis for many people. So we've ended up with Awab's law, for example, because a young boy essentially was killed by the home that he lived in. Now, that is unacceptable, and yet it happens all the time. I'm also a counsellor, as Alice knows, in Hackney, and I had 20 people from the London Renters Union come to my counsellor surgery on Sunday to talk to me about the situations that they find themselves in the private rented sector. So that's a combination of lack of regulation around housing costs, but also standards and a feeling that those people are trapped there and they're not able to move on to better accommodation. And then more broadly, I don't want to broaden this out too much, but I think it's really important to state at this point the defunding of local government since 2010, which started with Lord Pickles and the Housing and Planning Act, has continued through the Conservative period of government. So it's really important that, I know we're only 13 days in, but the Labour government gets to grips with the fundamentals of what it is to have proper housing management, whether it's in social housing for those that own stock, or whether it is functions like the one that I'm responsible for in Hackney, where people are coming to find support to deal with their private landlord, but in turn, that person is not held to any kind of a standard. And then obviously the deregulatory issues that have led to situations like Grenfell, and all of those were cost-cutting measures, again, to make sure that the builders and manufacturers of materials were able to increase their profit margins. And I just think we need to get a much better handle on that. I could say more, but I'm sure it might come out in the questions around some of those issues.
Great, thanks so much. And if we go to Josh and then perhaps to Michael, if Michael wishes to say anything on this point.
Thanks. Yeah. No, I agree with what Sam's just said again. I mean, I'm very encouraged by what Labour has been talking about around things like land value capture, giving local authorities the power, compulsory purchase powers, and regional authorities compulsory purchase powers to develop new towns or much sort of larger scale new developments. That's all great. That's what we need to do. I'm just not convinced that this will deal with the housing crisis we're facing today. That's a much longer term program, which is needed. But the issue today is, as we've heard, we have, I think, the worst rate of homelessness or people in temporary accommodation in Europe now. And we have incredibly problematic private rental sector where people are paying completely unaffordable rates of rent, and in completely inadequate conditions. And this is really to do with, yes, the financialization, commodification, whatever you want to call it, of housing provision in this country, and this kind of enormous faith in the private sector to sort of solve the problem via the provision of market priced housing. We do need a return to publicly funded council housing, social rented housing. It is a sensible way for government to spend money, creates a flow of income for the government over time. So money spent building on social housing shouldn't count against the public sector deficit. It should be seen as the creation of an asset for the public sector. The private sector has no incentive to build out at a rate in the area where they are building that would depress prices, because that would reduce their returns. This is a sort of really fundamental point that doesn't seem to have been understood by policymakers for the last 40 years, particularly the UK, very speculative development model where developers are competing with each other to get land, to buy land from landowners who are essentially allowed to sell the land at sort of hope value, you know, where everything is kind of 2-bed luxury flats. And clearly that is at the core of the development problem. So we do need to have more social housing and other development models. But in the shorter term, I think we've got to deal with this problem of under-occupation of housing by people who are essentially treating housing as a financial asset, not as a place to live. That has to be addressed.
Okay, thanks. So I appreciate that it's really hard to kind of stick with either cause or solution. It's all, you know, we're going to have to kind of talk about both at the same time. Michael, before I move on to the next one, did you want to add anything to that?
I just wanted to ask on something Josh said very early on about the inherently limited supply of favourably geographically located places to build housing. Now, I totally get that. I mean, everyone wants to live in central London. Wouldn't it be great if we could all live in central London? Well, no, it would be awful. It'd be a nightmare. But that's part of the problem. Is this an issue of centralisation? We live in a very centralised country, the UK. London dominates in a way no capital does in other European countries. And are there ways that the government could help to take off this pressure? Because London has its own special character in this whole issue. And perhaps a comment on that, thinking about that, the London focus.
Could we just stick to, is that a problem? We can come on to solutions in a moment. Do we think pressure on the southeast and London in particular is one of the issues that we're facing? Josh, and then
yeah, it's a huge problem. I totally agree. We live in one of the most centralized countries in Europe in terms of the sort of strength of one particular city vis-a-vis all the other urban conurbations. If you look at Germany and France, they have they have, you know, 7 or 8 really strong cities where you can get good jobs. In the UK, we kind of have 1 or 2, maybe, mainly London. And so that creates enormous pressure on housing in the southeast, as we all know. But you could partially deal with that solution by, for example, reforming property taxation, I think, in quite a significant way. I don't want to get onto solutions, but it's not just a case, I think, of ploughing millions and millions of billions of pounds into other parts of the country. I think there's other levers you can pull.
I mean, Sam, from a London point of view, what do you think about
that? I would I'd characterize it slightly differently. I think the challenge that we have in resolving the housing crisis, particularly from a London perspective, because there are questions about green belt, grey belt, and brownfield, and so on, ongoing debates. But we have the question, but also the answer is up or out, basically, I think, from my perspective. And so there's a question about density. So I'm not sure that I'm convinced that there is too much pressure on the southeast. I think all of those issues that exist are not insurmountable. I think, kind of going back to my response to you at the beginning, places become more attractive because they are well connected, because they have amenities. I think what we've suffered from is a situation where new neighborhoods are built and they don't have, you know, you might kind of build 200 new homes with nothing else around them, and, you know, the lack of thinking around access to jobs, to work, and so on. We've got so I think there is a political decision to be made, and I think there is a trade-off by everybody to be made, and I think that is one of them. I would say, just in partial response to that, I think the fact that we have lost, as partly again because of Brexit, lots of non-UK EU residents left London and the country after the referendum, but London's population has gone down, and it's progressively gone down for people of child rearing age. That's not to say the population is not growing as a whole, but we have a situation now where we have schools which don't have enough children in them to keep them going. And I think that is indicative of the fact that we haven't thought about who are the people that will be living in the homes that we build. So do we have those homes, 3-bedroom flats that people could be moving into? I think a proportionate and reasonable conversation about density could definitely overcome any concerns around pressure. There is a wider, I think, conversation to be had about, is it right that opportunities, investment, capital, all of those things that drive our society, they are focused mainly around London and the southeast, and I definitely would really welcome a more regionalised approach to developing our cities and investing in homes so that people could live in other parts of England and Wales. It's bizarre when you travel around the UK and then you go to other countries and everybody is traveling into London on the 9 o'clock train and there's no good reason why. So I think it's definitely, the solution is also part of the question for me.
Okay, so I had a third question, which was very, very much about. Sorry, I should just say there is somebody with a hand up, but if people with questions or statements, please write it in the chat. It's just we have a very large number of people here, so we're just trying to create a fair way for people to be able to contribute. And we only have an hour and a quarter, so it's already 22:02. So and we've already talked a bit about the narrative about the planning system and about the need to build more homes and about the fact that there are 350,000 planning permissions in London already. So, we need to build those homes, but what we're trying to get towards saying is that they're not being built, and that actually even if they are built quickly, that may not be really tackling the problems that exist. So that's kind of where we've got to. I think where we need to go now is to talk about what it is that London needs to make some steps forward. And I do wonder if, if we have the kind of emergency, feels like, there's stuff that we can't wait 5 years for. Sorry, I've just got to mute somebody. Hang on. And for those people who are facing, extreme problems right now, maybe because they don't have a home, or their temporary accommodation is somewhere miles from home, or indeed their costs are so high that they can't afford to do much other than pay for their rent. Is there something urgent that can be done in the next few years, or is this something that can't be solved for 10 years? So while we're talking through what the solutions are, I'd really like to be able to get a feel for, what we need to be doing right now, and what is more longer term perhaps. And it might not be possible to answer in those terms, but I do want to feel like, if we have a crisis, an emergency, feels like, there should we be talking about things that need to happen literally today. So the question is, what are the solutions, and what will London need from the new government? What devolutionary powers will be needed? What new housing legislation is needed and planned? What changes to the London plan might be needed, if any? Sorry, and I know that's quite a lot. But I did want to kind of make sure that we do make a meaningful, contribution on this, on the solutions, and not just talk about the problem for the whole meeting. So if it's okay, I'll go to Sem first, and then we'll go to Josh.
Yeah, I guess one thing, this is very much with my Labour hat on rather than my cross-party assembly hat on. One thing I would really love to see is if there were changes to the London plan and encouragement of development to happen at a faster rate. I would really love to see a presumption in favour of social housing if we through the planning process. So I think if I was mayor for a day, I would make it not possible to object to the development of social housing. as in the principle of it. So questions around design and so on, yes, absolutely. I think you could then have that conversation about density. I think there are some innovations which they cost money, they're in the ether, they exist, but they haven't happened at scale. So one example I always give, I live in Hackney in an ex-local authority flat on a housing estate. It's a relatively small estate. There are about 300 other flats, but replicated across the borough is the fact that my building and the buildings, and I'm in the top floor, all of those buildings have flat roofs. There are innovations which I know have been trialed or piloted here at City Hall with a few developers around adding 2 or 3 stories to my 4-story building to have maybe one layer of homes for rent, private rent, or for kind of low cost home ownership, and then a larger proportion of that for social rent. There is, you could overnight, I think, you would definitely increase the density of my estate, but that would be fine because it's not increasing the footprint. It's not affecting any amenity space. You'd increase the provision of social housing immediately by 60% in that location. So that's one thing I definitely think we should definitely think about in any changes to planning. I would also, I take the points that have been made in the chat about calling it a market and so on. And I think one of the things, but I think we need to kind of meet people where they are. We are still in a position where we're reliant on private developers to build out the homes that we require. And I think what was true before the election about London, in order for Sadiq to fund the homes that we need in London, the 4.9 billion, that number still stands. So what I think part of the solution is to make sure that we're working with the government, working with Angela Rayner and others to think about long-term funding, because the case has always been made that we're arguing kind of program to program on a 3-year cycle about what could be built out. Even if you had the plans in place in London and in other places, I hope other metro mayors do the same around their local planning. But even if you had the plans in place, the Affordable Homes Programme runs out in 2026. And so you need to start the process again. I think a government which is looking at 10, 15-year cycles. So whatever plans are put together by local communities and local government and regional government, there is the funding in place in principle to build the social housing that we need. And I would also say that we do need to accept that private housing is also part of the mix. We need to think about, I had a really interesting but quite niche presentation about vacancy chains last term. It strikes me that is something which has worked in some local authorities. Southwark use them amazingly well. In other local authorities, we react immediately in a slightly panicked way to a crisis situation, and actually by freeing up homes, so allowing people to move on according to their life stage and what they can afford, really helps people to get into that social housing or get on their first foot on the ladder, so that you're providing homes all the way through the chain.
The Mayor has talked about rent caps. I don't know if you can talk about that and whether there's any hope for
Oh, yeah.
Devolutionary powers with a new government. Is there any hope that we might see some help for the private rented sector, and what about regulation in that sector?
Okay, so one of the things that Angela Rayner has announced when she met all of the metro mayors last week was to invite them to put forward proposals before the 24th of September about what they would like to see in terms of devolution to their regions and cities. So I know that here at City Hall, Sadiq's team is working on that, not just on this particular area, but around a range of issues. I've just been in the Police and Crime Committee this morning, for example, and there are devolutionary measures that might, I don't know. There are things that I would want, but I'm not privy to those conversations, but they are happening. And the fact that that offer has been made is really welcome, because I suppose if you were cynical, you might say it does make people stick or twist. Like, you've been asking for all this stuff, put it down on paper. Let's see if we can make it happen, because ultimately it will come down to funding. But I think one of the what the announcements that Rachel Reeves has made around the changes to planning and so on, also quite welcome, but we need to see what they actually result in. I think we're in a bit of a position where we're looking at deeds, not words. So like I say, here in London, Sadiq did call for 2.2 billion extra funding, emergency funding, on top of the 4.5 that he had called for to build out. But but that was to kind of at least meet existing need. There is a wider issue that, back to your point about private renting. I'm in the Labour housing group, and I think, well, I know that sensible, serious conversations are being had with the national, well, I keep saying party, but the national government and those parts of the country for whom rent inflation is a particular issue, is particularly acute. I think one of the challenges that we have is that issues in the private rented sector are not the same anywhere. So in places like Bristol and Brighton, there's a situation similar to London in terms of affordability, but it's not as bad. And a solution that works in London won't necessarily work outside. So there is conversation happening definitely around rent stabilization. There is, I would say, and that's across Treasury, but also MHCLG, as far as I understand it. I'd really encourage people here to be part of those conversations and to respond to consultations as and when they happen. I've spotted a few names in the attendee list of people who are in the Labour housing group, because the next stage of this is to listen to people like the National Residential Landlords Association. I'm acutely aware that the voices of tenants, individually or collectively, may be lacking. And we need to turn those anecdotes that I could tell you, anyone elected could tell you, into data. So the next stage is data and looking at what a form of regulation might look like. And again, kind of that plea from me as the London chair of that particular group is to be able to fend off some of the, I wouldn't say attacks, because people are protecting their interests, but to be able to provide answers to the challenges that we will be faced with, to make sure that there is some control brought to the market. Now, in an ideal world, I would absolutely want a rent control. We need to work through what a stabilization might look like for London, and I'm sure other metro mayors will be doing exactly the same thing.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks so much. I mean, Josh, Sem has talked quite a lot there about continuing to focus on house building and the planning system. Is that your take? Do you feel that that's where we need to be, or where do you feel we need to be?
I feel we need to focus on much more on the existing stock and using it more efficiently. As I showed you, there is a huge amount of space in the existing stock that's not, a huge amount of housing is not being used properly. And this is, being defined as 2 spare bedrooms or more, So, and most of that is concentrated in the home ownership sector, around 90% of it nationally. And then within that, around 60% is people over the age of 60, who most of whom are not economically active. So, that's the fundamental challenge. How do we use that stock more efficiently? How do we encourage people to downsize? I fully appreciate that there may be a lack of appropriate accommodation for people in that situation, and that needs to be dealt with. But there are innovative solutions that could be looked at, that don't involve moving people out of their homes, such as offering opportunities to convert larger homes into flats where people stay in the same area so they don't lose their connections to the local community. But fundamentally, I think we do need to have quite drastic reform. And given your focus on the short-term situation, I would be looking to give local authorities, and given Sem's comments about Angela Rayner's offer, I would be looking to give local authorities much stronger powers around, for example, the right to first refusal when a home is being sold by, for example, a buy-to-let landlord to buy up that home and convert it to social rented use. And I think if we were introduce stronger regulations in the private rental sector around quality of home, fuel efficiency, home insulation, and perhaps some form of rent stabilization, you would potentially see quite a big shift out of the buy-to-let sector from certain landlords for whom it just wouldn't be affordable anymore. I mean, the higher interest rates we've seen over the last few years have already seen evidence of a shift. The problem has been that many of those homes in the PRS have just been snapped up by cash buyers who, once prices fall to a certain level, don't really mind if you're paying a bit more on stamp duty. Obviously, the government introduced this higher rate of stamp duty in 2016 on additional dwellings, but that didn't actually make much difference because there's all these cash buyers, sort of pent up demand for London property. I mean, I think we have to understand London housing and land in London as a sort of globally desirable asset, right? It's a bit like gold. It's something that will always be desired. And what that means is planning has a really important role in ensuring that scarce asset goes to the right places. And that's why giving local authorities right of first refusal on homes that come up for sale could be really interesting. Barcelona's doing it extremely effectively, these sort of policies right now. They have a fantastic affordable homes program, a lot of which is about buying existing stock. But the other thing I would do is reform the property tax system, which is completely shambolic. Council taxes haven't been revalued since 1991, and I would be looking to give local authorities the opportunity to charge more, in particular for this sort of under occupation problem that I've been talking about for second homes. And we really need to just clamp down on short-term lets, Airbnb, etc. These are incredibly inefficient uses of scarce, desirable locational properties. People shouldn't be allowed to convert homes that are in primary residences or in the private rental sector into short-term lets, because you're just directly reducing the stock available to people who actually work and live in the city where they're based, rather than tourists. I would be banning right to buy. I don't think it's a policy that has any merit, any justification, given the current crisis that we have. I would be looking at prohibiting foreign purchases of homes where there's clearly a speculative driver. So, I think we're sort of past the point of marginal change is the broader message I'm trying to make here. We have to aggressively tackle this highly inefficient use of the existing stock. I know it's politically difficult, but Labour has just got a huge majority. If not now, when would be the question for me.
Can I just add one thing before we move on, Alice?
Yes, I was going to see if Michael had anything to add and then come back to you to see if you wanted to respond to any of that. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly useful to have you here. So Michael's not going to add anything. So if you'd like to come in now, and then we're going to pick some questions from the audience. Sam.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add, so Josh has just ended on the fact that some of this is politically difficult. And I suppose there are lots of policy solutions, but I think we need to also, in the spirit of the new government, be also pragmatic about the fact that all of these policy solutions will hit reality. So one example I can think of, which local authorities contend with on a daily basis, is in London, the vast majority of stock is not affordable to those local authorities. And so dealing with people in temporary accommodation or homeless households, the really invidious option of moving people out of the capital. And so that is a solution. It's one that they have adopted, but it's one which is deeply unpopular and nobody wants to go. So I suppose, yes, we can propose that we should use the empty homes that exist more effectively, but if they're not in places that people want to go, can work, that will be separated from networks, I think we need to also reflect some of those challenges in the solution.
So I don't know if Josh, you were talking about that issue
No.
specifically.
No, I wasn't talking about empty homes, really. I mean, I appreciate the point that Sem's making, that some empty homes are not in the places people want to live. Fully agree. But my point was rather, can we make better use of the existing stock? And I think there are quick wins there, around as a sort of quite a large transfer potentially of low quality PRS stock moving into the social rented sector. Now, I fully agree with Sam that there's a money problem, right? Local authorities haven't got sufficient funds to do what I've just been talking about, and that clearly has to change. And one can get into a debate about whether the fiscal rules make any sense. I mean, I think a quick kind of answer to this problem would be for the government to either create a sort of national housing development corporation or housing bank or regional housing banks that could purchase these homes and do them up, retrofit them, etc. And that should be a public corporation, arm's length public corporation that would be whose assets would be off the public sector balance sheet, as is the case in most European countries. Public corporations of this type, their liabilities do not count towards the public sector net debt measure. We're a sort of idiosyncratic exception here in the UK that we count all the debt held by the British Investment Bank and our various other corporations on the balance sheet. This is just an accounting problem, right? It's the ONS for some reason decides that these assets that provide a flow of income over time for social rents, a very reliable source of income that pension funds and other organizations would be happy to invest in. But we're blocked from doing it by this sort of stupid accounting regulation. So that would be my sort of proposal for how to get around the financing problem.
Great, thanks, Josh. So Sam, you don't have anything to add to that. Let's go to some questions. So Michael Edwards and Lucy Rogers from Just Space have been monitoring the chat, and thank you, everybody. There's so many messages in there that as I've been trying to follow the speakers, I haven't been looking at it, but I will be really interested to read them afterwards. And as I said, I will circulate them, and do please continue to put those questions and statements into the chat. But for now, I'm going to go firstly to, was it Michael or Lucy? I can't remember who I said I'd go to first. Is it Michael?
You decide.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Michael, please go first.
Michael's going to has been checking the chat, and they're going to pick out a few questions. So Michael.
Okay. Well, the chat is, as you say, extremely rich with stuff. A lot of it is discussions and debates and suggestions and proposals rather than questions. One which is a very clear question, which I think we could ask our guests to comment on, is from Portia Muzimang, who says, how many of those planning permissions, which Alice mentioned at the beginning, those hundreds of thousands of unbuilt permissions, how many of those planning permissions which Alice mentioned are actually to build homes, and how many are to build more of the same? That is to say, just add to the surfeit of luxury and investment class for surplus capital. Is that a question which
It's an interesting question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't know if Sam or you would have any idea.
I'm afraid I don't know.
I mean, I think the principle in London is that 50% of what is built should be affordable, but of course, the problem that we have is that there's not the money to fund that, and so with the way that the private sector led system it works, it is a negotiation with the developer about how much of that development would end up as affordable. Does that kind of summarize it, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to add that I think Portia's question raises an important point, which is that any housing development which is funded by the Mayor of London's office, there is a floor of what should be, there's an expectation that if you're getting funding from the Mayor's office, that there is a minimum of 35% affordable. And it's at that point that you don't need to look at that, you can kind of continue on with the rest of your development. But I think the interesting question is, where is that for the private sector, who we're relying on to build lots of new homes? For who is the question.
And I wonder, Josh, if you could add anything in, and I don't know if you have anything to say about what we call the affordability umbrella these days, which means that perhaps of those 350,000, a number may be on a Help to Buy, or not actually social homes, I suppose. I don't know if, Josh, you have further to add on that.
Not so I quite understood the question, sorry.
No, so I was thinking, well, the question is, of those 350,000, how many would be for affordable? And I think that we have the affordability umbrella now. And actually, one of the things that I've been trying to understand is whether, if we create Help to Buy, if the affordability umbrella includes Help to Buy, then are we actually not creating affordable housing? Are we actually just putting more money into the demand side, and therefore continuing to fuel high house prices?
I mean, if I was a London mayor for a day or a whole year, I would be saying 100% affordable housing, with totally well insulated, very high standards of retrofit, built around transport links, so it's easy for people to get into London. I just don't think I think the current development model is broken. It rests upon a set of fairly oligopolistic, let's be honest, big developers, demanding double-digit returns on equity to their shareholders every quarter. That is simply not compatible with the building of genuinely affordable housing for the people of the city. I think that just has to be faced up to now. We've sort of gone beyond this, and attempts to sort of de-risk and subsidize the demand through Help to Buy and similar schemes have completely failed, in the sense that whilst they have helped some people onto the housing ladder, obviously, the net result, as you say, has been to pump more money into this limited supply of available space and push up medium house prices relative to people's income. So the aggregate impact has been negative, and it's decreased affordability. So we have to move away from just subsidizing the demand for market-based home ownership and move towards subsidizing the supply.
Okay, so I think Portia's 350,000 is not going to mean you can't just say it. I think the answer to that is, it's not all about the numbers, is it? It's about what we're building ultimately, and whether we're, the model that we have and the money that we have will deliver what's needed. So Lucy, what have you got for us? Lucy Rogers from Just Space.
Well, there's the chat is very much to do with people asking for requirements to be stronger, and especially definitions to be stronger. For example, Paul is saying, could speakers define what social housing is? There is no definition. We used to say council housing. And he adds, stop right to buy and buy to let. And of course, the definition of affordable. Now, these things are all, as I say, or as people are saying, requirements we want to be stronger. However, Rachel is saying, what do we know of the detail of this relaxing of the planning laws? And so I wonder whether it would be worth, considering Sem has said we can only pick the low-hanging fruit, or we have to deal with the reality. Could you say what things could be done in this new with these new, the laws coming in, which indeed seem to be about relaxing the laws rather than strengthening them? What do you think the possibilities are for achieving the things people are wanting? The stronger emphasis on affordable housing, the stopping of right to buy, and so on.
So we'll go to Sam first. I think that was a direct question to you.
Thank you. So I would say that affordable is defined in law, but unfortunately, it is not very helpful because it has changed the meaning of the term affordable. But in law, affordable housing is anything which is below a certain level of market. So I think I don't know if it's changed, but when the Housing and Planning Act came in, it was set at up to 80% of the market. So it's important. So that's when it became even more important to be able to make the distinction between what was set nationally as up to 80%. In practice, I think very few, if any, people in London ever built up to 80% of the local market because no one can afford that. And I think the reason I've been using social housing rather than council housing is to take into account the fact that there are councils who manage homes and develop homes, but there are also housing associations who provide not-for-profit providers who provide social homes. And I'm using that as an umbrella term to make sure that we're not missing out on housing association stock, which is normally a maximum about 60 to 65% of the market, whereas council housing had been historically, I think that the ideal position of about a third. And then with what's the word that means this? When the rents came together, something that George Osborne did, that there was a movement toward bringing the two a little bit closer together. So you'll see people talking about new builds being at a different level to somebody that's been in situ for a longer time. So those are the legal parameters that when somebody builds housing, when they say that they're building social, that's what they're building. When they say they're building affordable, that's what they're building. When a council says they're building homes for rent, that is what they're building. In London, one of the things that Sadiq Khan did when he was elected was to bring in a London definition of affordable rent for exactly the reasons that you have outlined. It is absurd to say in London that 80% of the market is affordable. It is not. And so every year, the Housing and Land team here at City Hall will release London affordable rents, and they are benchmarked at 1/3 of the median income, and it's set by ward. And so that is basically the target that people work to when they're considering affordable rent in London, if they're in receipt of mayoral money. And in terms of the stop the right to buy, that is definitely something that was in the manifesto. I know Matthew Pennycook has not used the strength of words that you have talked about here today. I had in my notes that the number to which right to buy sales that had taken place in London, it is around about 1,000. I can send it to Alice afterwards so I don't mislead anybody. But there is no doubt that the loss of 300,000 homes to right to buy has been devastating for rent for the rental market and supply in London. I was actually had this exact conversation the other day. What is a really, really rational decision? The person that we bought our flat from, they right to buy their home, and they made a really rational decision for their family. They bought a home in Kent, much cheaper outside of London, and they paid university fees for their children. Those individual rational decisions are completely irrational when it comes to making national policy. And so I think you need to strike a balance. In some places, like London, there is definitely an argument to be made about it is really undermining supply for local authorities. In other places, it might be less of an issue. And I would say some of it has become a little bit academic since the increase in interest rates, with the large discount that was offered. There's definitely a review taking place of the discount being offered, because even if you do have that money, you can't get a mortgage, and so sales have fallen off a cliff.
Okay, thanks, Sam. We're coming up to time, so Josh, if you could just say a last few words as well, and then we'll just come to a close with a few words from a couple of us. Josh.
Yeah, I don't think I have too much more to add, really. Fully agree with Sam on prohibiting right to buy in London. I think there is a sort of, perhaps there's a political path here where we can devolve more powers to local authorities and perhaps to mayors in particular, to take more ambitious and radical steps to deal with this crisis, if they're given the powers to do that. So including the power to do compulsory purchase and have first right of refusal, powers to make changes to property taxes where there is clearly under occupation of homes and inefficient use of homes and short-term lets. I don't think these are politically so difficult. I think you've seen Wales, for example, is doing some very interesting things, allowing local authorities to massively increase council tax on second homes in areas where there's high pressure on housing. I think that maybe that's the way forward, and it might be sometimes it's politically easier for Labour to do that than to just simply impose from the centre policies that may not be suitable actually in different parts of the country. So I really hope Sem clearly pushing this agenda, and I hope others in Labour can sort of follow suit. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Josh. And just before I thank everybody, I just wanted to talk briefly about next steps. So it seems to me that we have a lot of work to do to start to make representations around the devolution agenda for London, but also for planning and for housing and whatever legislation is coming forward there. And I think they're all equally as important. So I think we probably need to get together and think about how we can best enable the organisations to make those representations in a coherent way. So I'll just go to Michael Ball to say a couple of, if you've got 15 seconds on next steps from your point of view.
Well, we've got this housing charter. It covers a lot of this stuff very, very briefly, but there's depth behind it, and we need to get as much as we can behind that. And go to both parliamentary scrutiny and all the rest of it, and also London Plan. There's a policy in London Plan about encouraging build to rent. We need to take that apart. That's wrong. So there's plenty of work to do. There's a meeting tonight. Come along, 6 p.m, 31 Lee Street's in the chat. Be great to see you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much. And I realise, obviously, in an hour and a quarter with 100 people in the room, it's first of all impossible to represent everyone's views, and secondly, it's simply impossible to cover all the issues. But I am really, really happy that we have not dwelt on the issue of the green belt and the grey belt, because I just feel that it is a distraction from the issues that we really do need to be talking about. And however important we at CPRE London feel that the green belt is, and it is important, and however much we feel that the planning system is doing what it needs to do, which it is, we really need to keep focused on the people who are out there suffering on a day-to-day basis with unaffordable rents, insecure homes, and unsafe homes in some cases. So thank you, huge thanks to our speakers, Josh and Sam, and to Just Space for joining us, CPRE London, in putting this together. And we look forward to working with everybody again. And perhaps we can do another event a bit like this around autumn time to see where things have got to, because it's going to be a very fast moving agenda. So thanks very much to everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you. Nice to speak to you all.